welcome to CounterPunch Radio. My name is Eric Draitzer. Thanks so much for tuning in, coming back to the show. First-time listeners finding the show, welcome aboard. Always happy to have you. Go over to CounterPunch, help support CounterPunch during our fund drive. That is the way that you show how much you care about independent media and about CounterPunch, about maintaining this kind of a space on the left where competing ideas can be aired out, where we can unite around issues of war and peace and all of the other things that bring the left together. CounterPunch in many ways is the place to go for those kinds of analyses, and it's been that way for 30 plus years. So if you want to support CounterPunch, right now is a great time to do that. Go over to the website, give a donation. That helps keep the lights on, helps pay for the servers and all the other costs, both overt and covert, that you might not be thinking about. So that is, of course, greatly appreciated. This week, it's my pleasure to bring a second round of conversations between CounterPunchers Richard Falk, Matthew Stevenson, and Daniel Warner. This time they are talking about Trump, the phenomenon of Trump as a political figure and his impact socially and internationally, and there's a lot of other issues thrown in as well. I would just note this conversation was recorded before the attack on Gaza, before the blockade, and all of the other things that have dominated headlines over the last 4 weeks. So please do keep that in mind. That's the conspicuous absence of that subject is explained by the timing of the recording here. Again, Richard Falk, Matthew Stevenson, and Daniel Warner, all regular contributors to CounterPunch. Go over to CounterPunch, become a regular as well by supporting us during the fund drive. That is so appreciated. And as always, I would just let people know I will be back with more episodes very, very soon. I'm still working through a medical situation on my end, so that's kind of one of the reasons for the delay. But we are so fortunate to have these three excellent counterpunchers here to talk with you this week. Talk to you again real soon. Enjoy.
The three amigos are back together, this time not in the same room, but only in the same world. Richard, you're in Turkey. Daniel, you're in Geneva, and I'm in Slovakia, of all places. And for our conversation, this segment, this period, it's not a weekly program at this point, for this episode, we wanted to discuss the rubric on loving Trump. Richard, you're the coiner of the phrase on loving Trump. What did you have in mind when you came up with such a title?
Well, I think principally what to me is mystifying about the continuing popularity that Trump enjoys despite all the heinous things that he has done while president and since being president, and the degree to which he challenges the constitutional consensus that had always, at least since the Civil War, kept the U.S. together as a country and as a citizenry. So he's a radical figure that comes out of a kind of opportunistic extreme right that has a frightening fascist lineage. And let me just add one point to that, which is that Trump is an exaggeration, in my view, of a global phenomenon where one sees in a whole variety of cultural settings the emergence of autocratic leaders that enjoy widespread support from their population. So one could do something analogous on loving Modi or on loving Orban, or there are a number of loving Putin. All of these leaders somehow engender a level of popular support that defies the imagination that emerged out of an Enlightenment rationality.
Danny?
I think Richard made an excellent point, and I would develop it along the following line. President Biden talks about a historical moment, an inflection point where democracies versus autocracies are going on around the world. So one of the things to look at is not only the growth of autocracies or the extreme right wing in the United States, but why democracies are failing. And I include in this, obviously, the United States, which is supposed to be the leader of the free world. And why is it that the Democratic Party, for example, or in other countries, left-wing socialist parties are not doing better? So part of the success of Trump and the autocratic governments around the world is the failure of other forms of government at this time in history, especially those that are self-proclaimed democracies. So on the one hand, we can say we're mystified by Trump's success. On the other hand, we can lament why democracies are failing and losing popular support.
Richard, before I answer both of you, why don't you add something to what Danny has said?
Yes, I mean, I think that what Danny said about the loss of support for on the part of the left and for the governing process is correct, but I think there's also something missing if we don't acknowledge that this is not just a matter of normal political support. There is some kind of emotional underpinning that makes Trump invulnerable to the normal pitfalls of a political leader. And that's a problem with the citizenry, and it's a problem with democracy. It's why Athens, it's analogous to why Athens abandoned democracy, because the leading thinkers of the time, like Plato and Aristotle, Thucydides, felt that the ordinary public or the citizenry was too vulnerable to manipulation by demagogues. And what we're doing, in a way, is living in an era of where demagogues are dominating the political space.
Richard, can I ask you and Danny, are we living with them because the voice of the people has selected them, meaning that the democracy is functioning, it's just functioning in a way that none of us admire, or is it that they have managed to subvert the normal workings of a democracy and have rigged the ballots?
Well, I can just say one word about that. I think it's not the voice, it's the heart. It's the appeal that this kind of leader at this time has to the deep emotional well springs of human identity that somehow connects them not with the kind of figures that a modern society descended from this Enlightenment, rationality, and affirmation of science and truth would have anticipated. There's something else going on that's very fundamental, that's more connected with religion in a way than politics. And that's what I think is very hard to know how to counter in an effective way.
I think Richard's touched on the emotions of politics and how, in his first comment, Richard talked about manipulation. But now, in terms of Trump and his followers, there is an enormous animosity to a certain form of elitism, whether you call it bicoastal, whether you call it the degree gap between those who are college educated. And Richard goes back to Athens, Aristotle, and Plato. And in a sense, democracy is based on an openness, to citizens voting, and the citizens don't necessarily have to be graduates of Princeton University. And there is a definite disconnect between those in urban areas today, those in rural areas, those who are college educated or advanced degrees, those who are maybe high school graduates. So I think when Richard talks about religion, he's talking about emotions and a definite animosity toward a certain elite which came through, whether it be Georgetown, Harvard, etc. And Biden, who has tried to present himself as kind of the average Joe, middle-class Joe, University of Delaware, as opposed to Harvard or Yale, has not succeeded in touching that part of the population. And amazingly, Trump, somewhat to his credit, although as wealthy as he claims to be, has touched an emotional nerve with a large part of the population who didn't go to Wharton or wherever he got a degree from. And there is that animosity against an elite, I think, which is fundamental, certainly in the United States. I'm not sure if that's true in other places. And it is to the credit, to some extent, to previous presidents in the United States who had certain elitist backgrounds. You think of a Roosevelt, for example, who were able to touch a large part of the population, which the leaders, certainly in the United States today, are unable to do that. And I come back to the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan or Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, with all of their degrees. They remind me of the best and the brightest under Kennedy and certainly under Lyndon Johnson, who didn't understand much about Vietnam and certainly didn't understand much about the population. And it seems to me that Blinken and Jake Sullivan are part of a certain elitist that don't present themselves well to the general population and certainly are not able to communicate with Trump's followers.
But there's two sides to the Trump followers. There's the side of extreme wealth, which he does represent, and then there's the sort of what might the underclass, if you wanted, the disenfranchised, is a second side. But I would ask both of you to consider this, that Trump, rather than being an aberration, is a consistent pattern of American history, to wit, in the Constitutional Convention, the divide was between Franklin, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, what Richard would call on the side of the Enlightenment. And on the other side, there was Adams and George Washington and Alexander Hamilton, who really did want there to be an oligopoly that ran the United States. There was no secret there. And if you look at the Constitution, you don't need to be Charles Beard to see that the Constitution was drafted for those of extreme wealth. Slaveholders were defended. Capital more than rights were enshrined in the Constitution. And if you look at those two twin elements of American constitutional history between, let's call it the Enlightenment and be called the oligopoly, yes, Trump is extreme. Trump is extreme in his criminal conduct, but Trump's not the first politician to try to steal an election. That was done successfully in 1876. And Trump is not the only one to rally with extremes. We had Huey Long in the 30s. So my question is this, are we romanticizing the American past to draw a line under Trump when in fact that this is what we've always had for 245 years?
Well, I do think you're right that there is a kind of structural continuity that you can trace back to the Constitution and the early experience of being a post-colonial country and incorporating very fundamental injustices into this structure. But what I think is, and that's why I keep stressing that this is not a matter of the mind as much as of the heart, that there is a passion that transcends this urban-rural divide and the educated, uneducated class divisions that seems to me to adhere to this kind of leader at a moment in history where the species itself is in jeopardy, that through climate change, through the risk of nuclear war, there's a kind of disorientation that is maintained in part by the passion that leaders like Trump can generate. And it's a kind of macro denialism that is leading in a very destructive direction for American society and for a number of other societies as a paucity of leaders responsive to this demanding new world historical situation. And that's what I'm trying to sort of identify. And that's why I talked about on loving Trump, not just on supporting Trump. It's something else that's involved, and it can be the pathway to a fascist dictator.
Well, I think that the fact that the three of us, one is in Geneva, one is in Slovakia, one is in Turkey, indicates that we could be identified as globalists. And the question of identification, Richard, I think is crucial to this particular moment. We are living in a moment of complex interdependence. That's a reality. It's a technological reality. It's a financial reality. And the question is, how do people react to that globalist reality? And to a large extent, those who are nationalists and passionately nationalists are saying that they are against globalism. So to take the story of the bi-coastal, rural, and urban on another level, there also is out there a need of identity because certain people are worried and feel lost in the situation of globalism and complex interdependence. So to say, I am an American, I am Polish, I am Hungarian, in a sense, is a reaffirmation of an identity which gives a sense of security in the face of growing realization of the global actuality that's taking place. So I think that, to some extent, answers part of Richard's question about why there's such a strong belief in Trump, because I think people are worried, and identity politics comes to the fore when people feel insecure.
I agree, Danny, but I also think that there are globalist sides of Trump's philosophy in that, for example, denying climate change means I can use the atmosphere any way I want, and nobody should be able to tell me what I should be able to do with my patch of air. And the side of Trump that I find disquieting, in leaving aside the obvious criminality, which I think is manifest, but it's the nativist side of Trump, which comes out of, I would say it comes out of the Free Soilers, it comes out of the Know Nothing parties, it comes out of all these slightly kind of strange cultish positions in the 19th century. Trump is one of them. And Trump's followers, in effect, are not dissimilar to some of the utopians that found sort of redemption in slavery. They might have found it in economic isolation. You tell me. But Trump, the anger in Trump, I would say, is the nativist anger, anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic, anti-Black, pro-slavery. And that's, to me, the origins of Trump's philosophy.
Can I briefly react to that by saying that your remarks suggest to me that what Trump has managed to do is to create a Jonestown for America. In other words, a cult that encompasses the society. And it has, as you point out, these elements that have always been in the broader picture, but they've been marginalized by and large. He's brought them to the center, partly for these reasons that Danny and I have been mentioning. And I think I wanted to introduce this famous Gramsci comment that I don't have the exact words, but Gramsci said, in times of transition, morbid things happen. What we are experiencing, I think, is a stunted transition from a state-centric world to a globally coherent world. But the transition is encountering extraordinary resistance from this ultranationalism that expresses itself by extreme cruelty and hostility to migrants and to those that would breach these national divisions. So we're living amid uncertainty and contradiction of a depth that has never before been the experience of humanity.
Let me ask Matthew and Richard a question, therefore. If we can reach consensus that throughout American history there have been tendencies which have been in the background, come to the fore, but not to the extent they've come to the fore now, and we accept my comment about the insecurity and riches of globalization, how is it that we can calm the ardor of those people who are so nationalistic and so insecure about globalization and the change from the international to the global? Because if insecurity leads to this identity and potentially fascism, how do you deal with that? One way is, of course, what Hillary Clinton said, these are the people we don't want to talk to. I forget her exact phrase. But in a sense, if we ignore them, if we say the 75 million who voted for Trump the last time and maybe more will vote this time, we're being undemocratic. If it's an emotional problem, Richard, what are we going to do about it? We can't ignore it. Perhaps we could ignore it in Hungary or Poland, but within the United States, it's such a threat to the system. Somehow there has to be. How do you deal with this emotional situation today?
If you accept the premise that you're dealing with a form of love, that we have no instruments to counter that. That's why I feel rather gloomy about the future. And I think Biden is a kind of sign of the bankruptcy of opposition to a situation that is characterized by the emotion of love. It's a distorted love and has deforming impacts, but it is not going to be countered by enlightenment, rationality, or by material social protection measures. New Roosevelt wouldn't be able to handle this kind of passion, unless maybe if there was some deep crash of the economy, one would have another set of parameters to deal with. But short of that, I don't see any signs that there is a neutralizing force in America or many other places to deal with this emergent autocratic fascistic passion.
What I find extraordinary in looking at Trump from a distance is he really doesn't have a very consistent ideology himself. I don't think he's read 6 books since he finished, and he probably didn't even finish The Old Man and the Sea in the 11th grade. But the problem I have with Trump is, on one hand, his form of fascism is an economic fascism, in that he looks at the presidency, at government, as a way to enrich himself and his corporate cronies. I don't think he has national aspirations of a colonial, of an imperial colonial side. He might, but I think rather he looks at the world and says, how am I, Donald Trump, and my few followers, Jared and a few others, going to make money out of this situation? Which to me sounds like some of the businessmen in Rome around Mussolini in the 1920s, who didn't really care what Mussolini did or said or stood for, as long as they made money out of it. And so, Danny, I'd like to come back to your dichotomy between elites and non-elites as the division point. But since, to me, Trump is what Richard's describing, like a coup d'etat of a cult. Yes, 75 million people did vote Republican in the last presidential election. I don't think all 75 million people believe everything Trump believes, any more than everybody who voted for Biden agrees with everything Biden will do or has done. But let me ask you, is Trump's fascism of an international character, where he wants to make alliances with North Korea and Putin against Ukraine and Europe and the global South, or is it just a get-rich-quick scheme?
I think, Matthew, there's a little bit probably of both. But the argument is Richard's point, and I'll come to that, Matthew, about the difference between the international and the global, and Richard's gloom. I mean, I'm amazed at what's going on in New York at the UN. And after all, the Secretary General is more a secretary in certain ways than a general. But there is a certain moral leaning behind the charter. There's a certain moral role for the UN. It doesn't have an army. And yet here we have a meeting where the leaders come, talk about various issues. Climate change is coming up. And yet 4 of the 5 members of the Security Council, permanent members, did not have their leaders in New York. And I think this is, again, a part of a movement where there is little leadership, if not no leadership, on the part of the global community. I mean, I hate to use that expression, international community, but global community, so that if we're moving technologically, financially, away from nationalism to something larger, and certainly the problems of pandemics, the problems of climate change are global problems, there is no pretense for the moment at any form of global either leadership or moral leadership. And if Richard is focusing our attention on emotions, to listen to the Secretary General Guterres when there are 4 out of 5 leaders of the Security Council not there, I mean, it is very, very gloomy. So in that sense, Matthew, to think about a form of global government, I mean, Richard for years has talked about kind of a global assembly. We're getting further and further away from that at the same moment that the problems become more and more global.
Yes, I completely agree with this series of comments that Danny just made. I think part of the disaffection from the UN, I'm pretty sure Biden wouldn't have gone if the UN wasn't headquartered in New York, and he was the host of this gathering. There is a helplessness on the part of these supposed leading governments. And there's a feeling of a ship without a rudder. And I felt that ever since the US acted unilaterally in Iraq and to some extent in Afghanistan and Syria, the UN has demonstrated its irrelevance. And what the US has tried to do in this post-Ukraine period is to revive the UN or revitalize the UN as a instrument of its foreign policy, to rally countries against Russia, to compromise the veto, and to do various things that will make it more of an instrument than a community generating framework where countries that disagree can at least communicate with each other. So I see it as a low point for the UN and a high point for groups like the G7 and the BRICS, coalitions that are emerging outside the framework of the UN and purporting to address the agenda that should be central to what the UN is preoccupied and committed to do and has the funding that would enable it to do it. That was what part of the Secretary General's complaint was, that it has a voice, but it has no money. And you can't change the world without material capability.
I think you're right, Richard, in that the United States, maybe if the United States, if when John Quincy Adams was president, had the ability to be the counterweight to some of these negative trends in the UN and other bodies. But if you start about 1848 with the Mexican-American War and go through to the Spanish-American War up to Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and stops in between, the United States, for whatever reasons, probably economic, ceded that moral high ground to bring others behind the idealism that was present when the Constitution was drafted in 1789. Now Trump is in some ways in lockstep, the correct verb, I think, with so many of these other strongmen, North Korea, Russia, you name it, India. That's his peer group, and they don't want to hear anything about the issues that everybody else feels are sort of weighing on their soul: inflation, climate change, whatever they are. To me, the hope is somehow to allow the empowerment of what I consider a natural majority. In the United States, a natural majority is not for the 6-3 Supreme Court. It's not for Donald Trump's MAGA Republican Party, and it's not for the Senate of Mitch McConnell. The problem is that the Americans can't vote for the government that it both wants and deserves.
I wonder about that. That's an optimistic reading, I think. And we should remember that Biden is creating an atmosphere of moral hypocrisy on the fundamental issues that we're talking about. He stresses his friendship with Modi and is very ambivalent about the horrible things that Netanyahu is associated with. How can one talk about an alliance of democracies when you are so fundamentally hypocritical? It's an alliance against China. And to say, and any country that is willing to join that alliance, including Saudi Arabia, a very repressive, non-democratic country, is welcome to be in that alliance. And so the ideological roots of democracy are themselves not credible as a posture that opposes Trump. So Trump is the real thing when you look at it this way. And he did have a vision of bypassing Europe and having a new geopolitical alignment with China and Russia, which might have avoided the Ukraine crisis, I'm not sure, or at least handled it very, very differently. And so we're in a period where the either or of American politics leaves one with very little foundation for genuine hope.
Well, I mean, I think Richard is spot on. I mentioned the United Nations because I'm trying to see if we don't want to love Trump, we should want to love something. We can love our families, we can love our friends, but in a larger sense, in a moment of uncertainty and insecurity, we're looking for certain places where we can believe and even love, if you want to use that word. And the examples we have out there, the United States, Richard's word hypocrisy is spot on. The United Nations, the international community, the Charter of the United Nations, human rights, we could go on. They're not out there. And that's why I asked the question about where can we look for something positive. And I do think that lots of people are not going to vote in the United States this time, perhaps not even thinking that, well, if Trump gets elected, does it make that much difference? So I think there is not only gloom out there, but I would say that people are turning more to their own needs, small needs, family needs, financial needs, or whatever. But the whole concept of being part of a larger audience, a democratic audience, a larger part of a global marketplace is losing whatever appeal it might have. And it's interesting to watch the paradox that at the same time the world becomes complex, interdependent, we become back to a certain form of tribalism. And certainly Trump and the cult of Trump is an example of that return to a kind of simplistic, primitive tribalism that we thought we had overcome, or that technologically demands a certain kind of response.
Well, at the risk of becoming the closet optimist in this conversation, which is not my normal role in most conversations, let me just try a little bit to give I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I do want to posit the slightly positive side, which is I think that Trump's election in 2016 was an anomaly. They happen in American politics. His was an anomaly. Hillary Clinton, for whatever reason, had a lot of negatives that people didn't want to vote for. Leave that aside. He didn't win in 18. He didn't win in 20. He didn't win in 22, or his proxies. I don't think he wins in 24. If he does win, I think we can, however negative you've been, you can be more negative. But I would also say, Danny and Richard, that I do think in younger generations, our children, your children, everybody's children, when you see some of the things that they're willing to tackle, climate change, inequality, economic distribution into the global South, and they're devoting their lives to these causes, not simply just kind of attending a rally here and there. That has to, at some level, that generation has to be heard. It's not being heard by the Bidens and by the Supreme Court and by the Senate and by Trump, and that's to the detriment of all of us. And they're not being heard in countries beyond the United States, not being heard in India, Israel, Korea, you name it. But I do think in that younger generation, there is eloquence and there's optimism. Maybe optimism may be the wrong word. there's at least a path that they're willing to commit themselves to.
Matthew, I completely agree, and I'm impressed by the young people doing what you said. The question is the relationship between what they're doing and politics. And we started with the notion of Biden democracy, and democracy has a cultural background to it, but it also has a very simple administrative one. And the question is how these young people can not only do what they're doing, but also get involved in a democratic process, political party, etc. And that seems to me to be complicated today.
Just to add to a word to that, the political party that is in opposition to Trump is not something that is attractive to these idealistic younger people. So they have to almost create their own new organizing framework and mobilize support, which is possible to happen. Lots of unpredictable things have happened in our lifetimes, so we shouldn't discount that. And I would share the view that the younger generation is more attuned to how the world needs to work if it is to overcome these challenges that are confronting the society and are being met by mediocre or worse leadership in the principal countries of the world.
Since we're getting close to running out of time, let's end on it, whether it's positive or negative, let's end on a literary note, since you're both big readers. Let's each recommend to our listeners who've been with us for all these 48 minutes, a book that you've read, doesn't even have to be recently, that you think might be worth kind of adding to some of the commentary on the subjects we've been discussing today. Dan, you mentioned The Best and the Brightest, which is a show in and of itself about the making of foreign policy in Vietnam. But is there another book that you might recommend to our listeners?
Well, I was rereading Stanley Hoffman's book, Duties Beyond Borders, and I was working on how little is going to humanitarian assistance today and how much money is being spent militarily. And I think it's important when we see the people fleeing the global south, the desperation, and how here in Geneva, the International Committee of the Red Cross has a considerable deficit in its budget. And it seems to me the Duties Beyond Borders is a good book to reread. Stanley Hoffman.
No, I agree with that. And there are a lot of books that I sort of would like to recommend. But I think for Americans, maybe this book that was written 10 years or so ago with the title, What's Wrong with Kansas, is a good place to begin because it focuses on this phenomenon of people voting against their own interests, raises questions about how the society is organized and how the capitalist mystique has led people to be distracted through these cultural issues like abortion and gay rights and other things. I mean, we haven't talked about that, but I think that's all part of this, the alienation that is, in some sense, one of the sources of loving Trump, that he provides some kind of overview of the good society, which is really a caricature, and in what it really embraces is the coherence of the bad society. But it's something that engenders this kind of widespread love.
Well, I was going to suggest the Sinclair Lewis novel, It Can't Happen Here, which was about the 1936 election, which results, it's fiction, but it results in not Roosevelt's landslide win over Alf Landon, but the election of a fascist American senator who was very Trump-like in his depiction by Sinclair Lewis. And it describes, quite a long novel, I would say more than 400 pages, about how the United States, at least in a fictional sense, and I would say in a current sense with the MAGA Republicans, did embrace a native form of fascism. It might not have been Mussolini on his balcony, but it had all the elements. Now, Sinclair Lewis's novel ends not on a pessimistic note, that in the sense that the fascism burns itself out like some wildfire in the West, but it certainly, the Lewis thesis is, don't think that you're above the descent into anarchy, which so many other countries have descended into, because, as he says in his title, it can happen here. I think we've reached the end of our allotted time, gentlemen. One last wrap-up thought. Let's end with Richard. Danny, you go first, I'll go second, and Richard will go third. Wrap up with anything you'd like to add.
Well, I think the fact that the three of us continue to talk, in spite of the fact that we're spread out around the world, is an indication that we shouldn't be all too gloomy.
Well, since I'm here in Prešov, which is in eastern Slovakia, I will quote David Lloyd George, who was one of the architects of world peace at Versailles, and in theory on the side of angels, at least in some telling of history, not so much my telling of history, but at Versailles, they were talking about Slovakia, Wilson or whatever, and David Lloyd George said, "Who are the Slovaks? I can't quite seem to place them." So it tells you that our leaders have limitations if we expect the direction from the top. Richard?
I certainly agree with that parting sentiment, and I'd say that we can't know the future, but we can struggle to create the future we believe in. And if that message is widely enough disseminated, it might generate a new kind of political energy that could reframe politics in the United States and elsewhere.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Danny. And we'll be back as the three of us at a date to be determined soon. Thanks again.